Could it be that hidden within this simple description, the answers to the skeptics' most difficult questions may be found? Having served as director of one of the United States Defense Department's major research and development laboratories, Dr. Walt Brown comes with an impressive list of credentials and credibility. In tackling the subject of Earth's geological development, Dr. Brown has developed a theory that contradicts the generally accepted viewpoint of the scientific community. Profound and far-reaching, this respected scientist's hydroplate theory not only offers a completely new approach to the geological sciences, it succeeds where the prevailing theory often fails. It simply and logically explains some of the Earth's most profound mysteries.
We can see on our planet 25 major features that can now be systematically explained as a consequence of a global flood that erupted from subterranean chambers with an energy release exceeding the explosion of 30 trillion hydrogen bombs. This theory shows us just how rapidly major mountains form. It explains the coal, oil, and methane deposits, the rapid continental drift, and why on the ocean floor there are huge trenches, hundreds of canyons, and tens of thousands of volcanoes. This theory also explains the ice ages, and it gives the primary reason for global warming. It explains the formation of the layered strata in almost all fossils, the frozen mammoths, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. Surprisingly, it explains the origin of comets, of asteroids, and of meteorites.
According to Dr. Brown's theory, the ancient world that Noah lived in was very different from the Earth we occupy today.
Noah and other pre-flood people probably lived on one very large supercontinent with lush vegetation, inland seas, and major rivers. The mountains were smaller than today's, perhaps 6,000 feet high. Before the flood, about half the Earth's water was in interconnected chambers, about 10 miles below the Earth's surface. This formed a thin spherical shell, almost a mile thick. The pressure in the subterranean chamber had been increasing for centuries because the gravity of the sun and moon produced tides in the subterranean water that lifted and lowered the Earth's massive crust twice a day. This tidal pumping added gigantic amounts of energy to the subterranean water. This increasing pressure in the subterranean water steadily stretched the crust as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began as a microscopic crack that grew in both directions at almost 3 miles per second. The crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in about 2 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched claw. So the water exploded violently out of the rupture. The Bible even gives us a precise date, the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open. Then it says, and the rain fell. The fountains of water jetted supersonically into and above the atmosphere. The spray from these enormous fountains produced torrential rain such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. The supersonic fountains eroded the crumbling rock on both sides of the widening crack. This produced huge volumes of sediments that settled through the floodwaters, trapping and burying plants and animals, forming the fossil record. Eventually, the crack became so wide that the newly exposed floor of the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the Earth like the seam of a baseball. The continental plates, with lubricating water still beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of approximately 40 to 50 miles per hour, they ran into resistances, and like a runaway crashing train, they compressed, crushed, buckled, and thickened, rising out of the floodwaters. This is why the major mountains are generally parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. Today's major mountains were all pushed up in hours. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the mid-Atlantic ridge, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters retreated.
This theory of a massive worldwide catastrophe in antiquity appears to support the biblical story of the deluge in every detail. But what other evidence exists to support this amazing theory?
In 1970, I predicted that large pools of salt water would be found beneath major mountains. That prediction has been confirmed in several ways, by gravity studies, by seismic studies, and by electromagnetic studies.
A paper published in the April 2001 issue of Science magazine announced the discovery of an electrically conductive layer under the Tibetan Plateau. The article suggested that such high conductivity at depths of approximately 10 miles could be achieved by a layer of aqueous fluids, some 1.6 kilometers thick and containing 10% brine. In other words, salt water.
Just how big these subterranean layers of water will turn out to be, no one really knows. But the article points out that the conductivity is evident across the entire Tibetan Plateau.
Recently, even more evidence to support Dr. Brown's theory became available. On March 22, 1998, a group of boys playing basketball in Monahans, Texas, narrowly missed being struck by a 3-pound meteorite that crashed to the ground 40 feet from where they were playing. The police were notified, and 48 hours later, NASA scientists cracked the meteorite open in a cleanroom laboratory. What they discovered inside stunned them all. The meteorites contained salt crystals and liquid water.
The NASA scientists who investigated this meteorite believe it came from an asteroid. That's unlikely, because asteroids in the vacuum of space cannot sustain liquid water, which is required to form salt crystals. It's also too cold and there's too little gravity. Earth is the only body in the solar system that can sustain liquid water on its surface. This demonstrates the enormous power of the subterranean supercritical water, the fountains of the great deep that launch water and rock fragments into orbit around the sun. These rock fragments are still returning to the Earth as meteorites. Meteorites contain Earth-like material, including many types of living but dormant bacteria. This means that meteorites and their bacteria didn't originate in the vacuum of space. Meteorites are literally tiny chunks of the Earth itself returning home.
Scientists are also scratching their heads over another recent discovery. On the Kola Peninsula in northern Russia, they have created the world's deepest hole, extending to a depth of 7.5 miles. At this depth, what they expected to find was a layer of basalt, Earth's most common type of volcanic rock. What they actually discovered was something entirely different.
The hole didn't reach the basalt underlying the granite continents, but to everyone's surprise, they did reach hot, salty water flowing through crushed granite. Geologists are mystified, but the hydroplate theory provides a simple explanation.
Did the springs of the great deep burst forth and flood the entire Earth, just as the Bible says? Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory offers us a plausible scientific explanation for how this may have happened. But is there something more important to this theory? Could it be yet another example of the supernatural engineering observed throughout the Bible? If we now know where the water of the Great Flood came from, the same water that was instrumental in forming the fossil record, then when the Great Flood receded, where did all the water go? The answer to that question not only bolsters the scientific theory that a worldwide flood actually took place, it also provides an alternative explanation for the formation of one of the world's greatest natural wonders.
This is the question that stops most scientific investigators dead in their tracks. Yet the hydroplate theory makes the answer obvious. As the hydroplates crashed, they thickened and rose out of the water, forcing the floodwaters over the continents to recede. Simultaneously, upward surging subterranean water was choked off. As the floodwater drained off the continents, every continental basin was left brimful of water, producing many post-flood lakes. During the following centuries, some lakes breached their boundaries by either spilling over their rims or undercutting their banks. The rapid, catastrophic discharge of these lakes, much like the collapse of a large dam, carved canyons. Several centuries after the flood, two very large ancient lakes, Grand Lake and Hopi Lake, sitting on top of the high, rising Colorado Plateau, breached their boundaries and carved the Grand Canyon in just a few weeks. The massive canyon was not carved by the relatively small Colorado River over millions of years. That river is a consequence of the carving of the Grand Canyon.
Can the residual waters of Noah's flood account for the amazing natural beauty of the Grand Canyon? If Dr. Brown's theory is correct, then the Grand Canyon was carved only a few thousand years ago, and nearly every geology textbook needs to be rewritten.
One has only to look at the Earth's anomalies to see that the hydroplate theory provides a far better explanation of the Earth's present condition than the other more prevalent, well-propagated, but highly implausible theories.
Were key geological markers, like the Grand Canyon, formed over millions of years? Or did they come to be within the short time frame of Noah's flood? The hydroplate theory, which supports the story of Noah's flood, says it was the latter. If that is true, what better example of supernatural engineering could one ask for?
We are at the place in our consideration of the book of Genesis, which tells the story of the deluge, whose significance, both in religious and profane history, cannot be overestimated. Neither are there more interesting facts in the entire Old Testament than what the flood did to the earth. I will not be able to do more than introduce the subject here. We have all been made richer by the great number of books which have been written on this subject in modern times, which we may describe as science at its best. Some of this material is also on the Internet, thanks to Dr. Walt Brown, whose address is www.goodnet.com. I admit that I am shamelessly plagiarizing the information you will hear in this program. First, let me read the Genesis account, which is in the 6th and 7th chapters. I shall excise repetitious verses for the sake of brevity. I shall also make a few comments on some of the verses. And God, seeing that the wickedness of men was great on the earth, and that all the thought of their heart was bent on evil at all times, it repented him that he had made man on the earth. And being touched inwardly with sorrow of heart, he said, I will destroy man, whom I have created, from the face of the earth, from man even to beasts, from the creeping things even to the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. But Noah found grace before the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just and perfect man in his generations. He walked with God. And he begot 3 sons, Sem, Cam, and Japheth. God said to Noah, The end of all flesh is come before me. The earth is filled with iniquity through them, and I will destroy them with the earth. Make thee an ark of timber planks. Thou shalt make little rooms in the ark, and thou shalt pitch it within and without. And thus shalt thou make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. Thou shalt make a window in the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish the top of it. And the door of the ark thou shalt set in the side, with lower, middle chambers, and 3rd stories shalt thou make it. Close quotations. The dimensions of the ark were 450 feet in length, 65 feet in width, and 45 feet in height. This is a minimal measurement, since there were various sizes of cubits, the smallest being about 1.5 feet. A 450 feet long barge would snugly fit into a football stadium and would be taller than a 4-story building. The ark did not look like a boat. It had a flat bottom, was not streamlined, and had windows only in its top floor. The flat bottom would have made its loading, which was on dry land, easier. We may visualize this huge container as totally enclosed except for the windows in the top story for air and light. The top story of the ark was for the 8 humans on board, the 2nd story was for the animals, and the bottom floor was for the wastes of all the creatures. The ark was a purely utilitarian vessel without frills or ornamentation, whose design perfectly fit its purpose. the Genesis account continues. Behold, I will bring the waters of a great flood upon the earth, to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life under heaven. All things that are in the earth shall be consumed. And I will establish my covenant with thee, and thou shalt enter into the ark, thou and thy sons, and thy wife, and the wives of thy sons with thee. And of every living creature of all flesh thou shalt bring 2 of a sort into the ark, that they may live with thee, of the male sex and the female, of fowls according to their kind, and of beasts in their kind, and of everything that creepeth on the earth according to its kind. 2 of every sort shall go in with thee, that they may live. Close quotations. The ark, holding at least 1.5 million cubic feet of space, was adequate to hold these animals and their provisions for 1 year. Since the flood, many of the offspring of those on the ark would have become reproductively isolated in some degree due to mutations, natural genetic variations, and geographic dispersion. Thus, variations within a kind have proliferated. Each variation did not have to be represented on the ark. For example, a pair of wolf-like animals were probably the ancestors of coyotes, the dingoes, the jackals, foxes, and hundreds of varieties of domestic dogs. This is microevolution, not macroevolution, since each member of the dog kind can interbreed and has the same organs and genetic structure. Genesis continues, Thou shalt take unto thee of all food that may be eaten, and thou shalt lay it up with thee, and it shall be food for thee and them. And Noah did all things which God commanded him. They that went in, male and female, of all flesh, as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in on the outside. In the 600th year of the life of Noah, in the 2nd month, in the 17th day of the month, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the floodgates of heaven were opened. And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and lifted up the ark on high from the earth. For they overflowed exceedingly, and filled all on the face of the earth, and the ark was carried upon the waters. And the waters prevailed beyond measure upon the earth, and all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The water was 15 cubits higher than the mountains which it covered. And all flesh was destroyed that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle and of beasts, and of all creeping things that creep upon the earth, and all men. And all things wherein there is the breath of life on earth died. And Noah only remained, and they that were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. Close quotations. Dr. Brown informs us that among creationist geologists there is a certain popularity for what is called the Hydroplate Theory, which is an effort to explain what the construction of the earth was when it was newly made and what kind of damage the great flood did and why. For an understanding of this theory, think in terms of what they refer to as plate tectonics. According to the standard version of this theory, the earth's crust is composed of a dozen or so plates, each approximately 30 miles thick. These plates supposedly move with respect to each other at about an inch per year, the rate a fingernail grows. Continents and oceans ride on top of these plates. Sometimes a continent, such as North America, is on more than one plate. For example, different parts of North America, separated by a fault running up through California, are sliding past each other. Supposedly, material from deep inside the earth is rising toward the crest of the entire mid-oceanic ridge. Once it reaches the crest, it moves laterally away from the ridge. This claimed motion is similar to that of a conveyor belt arising from under a floor and then moving horizontally along the floor. I just mentioned the mid-oceanic ridge. That this exists is one of the most remarkable discoveries of this century, which was made in the 1950s. It is a mountain range that is 46,000 miles long and wraps around the earth. Since most of it lies on the ocean floor, relatively few people even know it exists. How did it get there? Why is it composed of a type of rock called basalt that is so different from the rocks of most other mountains? According to the Hydroplate Theory, before the flood, the land of the earth was a single land mass. This is the way the dry land is described in the first and second chapters of Genesis. Furthermore, the earth was fairly level. What mountains there were of low or medium range. The great mountain chains, such as the Himalayas, the Apennines, the Rockies, the Appalachians, the Andes, are the result of the great cataclysm of the flood, as we shall see. Before the flood, the earth had a large amount of salty subterranean water, about half of what is now in the oceans. This subterranean water was contained in interconnected chambers that collectively formed a thin spherical shell. It averaged about 5/8 of a mile in thickness and was located 10 miles below the earth's surface. Beneath this subterranean water was a layer of basaltic rock, and beneath the basalt was the top of the earth's mantle. An important distinction between the basaltic rock and the upper mantle was discovered in 1909 by seismologist Andrija Mohorovičić. He noticed that earthquake waves passing into the mantle suddenly increased in speed. This boundary, now called the Mohorovičić discontinuity, has for obvious reasons been shortened to the Moho. The final assumption of the hydroplate theory is that the pressure in the layer of subterranean water was increasing. Many things could have caused this. For example, a very slight increase in the mantle's temperature due to radioactive decay would expand the mantle. This in turn would increase the pressure in the subterranean water. Another possibility is that an asteroid struck the earth and suddenly pressurized the subterranean water. We think of the deluge cataclysm as a four-phase event. First, the eruption of the fountains of the deep and consequent torrential downpour of water. Second, the continental drift phase. Third, the compression event. Fourth, the recovery phase. The increasing pressure in the subterranean water stretched the overlying crust just as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Eventually, this shell of rock reached its failure point. Failure began with a microscopic crack. Stress concentration at both ends of the crack resulted in its rapid propagation at about 2 miles per second, nearly the velocity of sound in rock. The crack followed the path of least resistance, generally along a great circle path, moving northward and southward. The ends of the crack traveled in opposite directions, circling the earth in several hours. The initial stresses were largely relieved when one end of the crack ran into the path left by the other end. In other words, the path traveled by this crack intersected itself somewhere on the opposite side of the earth from where the rupture began. As the crack raced around the earth, the 10-mile thick roof of overlying rock opened like a rip in a tightly stretched cloth. The pressure in the subterranean chamber immediately beneath the rupture suddenly dropped to almost atmospheric pressure. Water exploded with great violence out of the 10-mile deep slit, which wrapped around the earth like the seam of a baseball. All along this globe-circling rupture, a fountain of water jetted supersonically into and above the atmosphere. The water fragmented into an ocean of droplets that fell to the earth great distances away. This produced torrential rain such as the earth had never experienced before or after. Some jetting water rose above the atmosphere where the droplets froze. Huge masses of extremely cold, muddy hail fell in certain locations where it buried, suffocated, and froze many animals, including some mammoths. The extreme force of the 46,000-mile-long sheet in upward jetting water rapidly eroded both sides of the crack. Eroded particles or sediments were swept up in the waters that gushed out from the rupture, giving the water a thick, muddy consistency. These sediments settled out over the earth's surface in days, trapping and burying many plants and animals, beginning the process of forming most of the world's fossils. The rising flood waters eventually blanketed the water jetting from the rupture, although water still surged out of the rupture. Global flooding occurred over the Earth's relatively smooth topography, since today's major mountains had not yet formed. The flooding uprooted most of the Earth's abundant vegetation. Much of it was transported by the flood's currents to regions where it accumulated in great masses. Some vegetation even drifted to the South Pole. Later, during the continental drift phase, buried layers of vegetation were rapidly compressed and heated, precisely the conditions required to form coal and oil. The flood phase ended with the continents near their present location. Second, the continental drift phase. Material within the earth is compressed by the weight of overlying rock. Rock's slight elasticity gives it spring-like characteristics. The deeper the rock, the more tightly compressed the spring, all the way down to the center of the earth. During the flood phase, the rupture path widened as erosion continued. Eventually the width was so great that the compressed rock beneath the subterranean chamber was on the verge of springing upward. The 46,000-mile rupture path only crossed the equator in two places, one in what is now the Pacific and the other in the Atlantic. However, the Atlantic location lies along the equator for 2,000 miles. Its length and location, then, caused the initial instability to occur there. As the ridge rose, it lifted adjacent material just enough to cause it to become unstable and also spring upward. This process continued all along the path of the rupture, forming the mid-oceanic ridge. The ridge rose several miles and elevated the granite plates along the flanks of the ridge. As the plates rose, they began to slide downhill. The plates were well lubricated by the subterranean water still escaping from beneath them. They slid east and west because the mid-Atlantic ridge extends north and south. This process resembled the following. A long train sits at one end of a very long track. If we could somehow just barely lift the end of the track under the train would start rolling downhill. Then we could lift the track even higher, causing the train to accelerate even more. If this continued and the wheels were well greased, the high-speed train would eventually crash into something. The long train of boxcars would suddenly decelerate, compress, and jackknife. Third, the compression event. Continental plates accelerate away from the segment of the mid-oceanic ridge, now called the mid-Atlantic ridge. As they did, the Atlantic Ocean basin opened up. Eventually, the drifting, actually accelerating continental plates, or hydroplates, ran into resistances of two types. The first happened as the water lubricant beneath each sliding plate was depleted. The second occurred when a plate collided with something. For example, India literally collided with Asia, and the eastern coast of North America collided with the rising portion of the mid-oceanic ridge. As each massive hydroplate decelerated, it experienced a gigantic compression event, buckling, crushing, and thickening each plate. To illustrate how extreme the compression was, imagine yourself in a car traveling at about 45 miles per hour. You gently step on the brake as you approach a stoplight and brace yourself by straightening and stiffening your arms against the steering wheel. You might feel about 15 pounds of compressive force in each arm, just as you feel lifting 15 pounds above your head. If we could repeat your gentle deceleration at the stoplight, but each time double your weight, the compressive force in your arms would also double each time. After 6 doublings, especially if you were sitting on a lubricated surface, your arm bones would break. If your bones were made of steel, they would break after 9 doublings. If your arm bones were 1 foot in diameter and made of granite, a much stronger material, 17 doublings would crush them. This compression would be comparable to that at the surface of each hydroplate. The compression at the base of the hydroplate exceeded the crushing strength of granite, even before the deceleration, simply due to the weight of the overlying rock. Consequently, the compression event at the end of the continental drift phase easily and continually crushed and thickened the hydroplate for many minutes. Mountains were quickly squeezed up. Buckling occurred in the thinner portions of the hydroplates. Crushing and upward buckling formed major mountain ridges, while downward buckling formed oceanic trenches. As explained earlier, the forces for this dramatic event could not be applied to stationary continents resting on other rock. The force was dynamic, produced by slow-moving hydroplates riding on lubricating water that had not yet escaped from below. Naturally, the long axis of each buckled mountain and each trench were perpendicular to its hydroplate's motion, or parallel to the portion of the mid-oceanic ridge from which it slid. Thus the Rocky Mountains, Appalachians, and Andes have a north-south orientation. The Himalayas have a northwest-southeast orientation because their hydroplate slid from the mid-Indian oceanic ridge. Since most plates moved toward the Pacific basin, the Pacific is surrounded by trenches and mountain ranges that parallel each other. Friction at the base of skidding hydroplates generated immense heat, enough to melt rock and produce massive volumes of magma. Crushing produced similar effects as broken and compressed blocks and particles slid past each other. The deeper the sliding, the greater the pressure pushing the sliding surfaces together, and the greater the frictional heat generated. In some regions, the high temperatures and pressures formed metamorphic rock. Where this heat was intense, rock melted. This high-pressure magma squirted up through cracks between broken blocks, producing other metamorphic rocks. Sometimes it escaped to the Earth's surface, producing volcanic activity and floods of lava outpourings, such as we see in the Columbia and Deccan plateaus. This was the beginning of the Earth's volcanic activity. Other magma collected in pockets, which are now called magma chambers. Magma sometimes escapes through these chambers and produces volcanoes. Thus, volcanic activity surrounds the Pacific Ocean in a region called the Ring of Fire. This corresponds to the leading edges of the hydroplates where compression and crushing would have in general been the greatest. The heat remaining today is called geothermal heat. Fourth, the recovery phase. Where did the water go? As the compression event began on a particular plate, the continents began to thicken. Continents rose out of the water, and mountains grew from the weakest or most severely crushed and buckled portions of the continents. As they did, the floodwaters over the continents receded. Simultaneously, the violent force of the upward surging subterranean water was choked off as the plates settled onto the floor of the subterranean chamber. Without sinking hydroplates to produce the high-pressure flow, water was no longer forced up. Instead, the deep basins between the continents became reservoirs into which the floodwaters returned. As you will recall, these deep reservoirs were initially part of the basalt floor of the subterranean chamber, 10 5/8 miles below the Earth's surface. Consequently, the surface of the ocean immediately after the flood was several miles lower than it is today. This provided wide land bridges between all continents, facilitating the migration of animals and people for perhaps several centuries. Drainage of the floodwaters down the deep continental slopes eroded deep channels, which today are called submarine canyons. As the sea level rose, animals were forced to higher ground and were sometimes even isolated on islands far from our present continental boundaries. Classic examples of this are the different species of finches and other animals Charles Darwin found on the Galapagos Islands, 650 miles off the coast of Ecuador. Darwin believed the finches were blown there during a giant storm. While some may believe that story, it also requires that both a male and female finch ended up on the same island, or at least one pregnant female. The more sediment continents carried and the thicker continents grew during the crushing of the compression event, the deeper they sank. Of course, the moho was depressed in the process. Newly formed mountains sank even more, slowly depressing the moho beneath them to depths of 20 to 30 miles. The moho and mantle under the ocean floor rose along with the ocean floor. This is why continental material is so different from oceanic material, and why the moho is so deep beneath mountains and yet so shallow beneath the ocean floor. Many other things were far from equilibrium after the continental drift phase. Over the centuries, the new mountain ranges and thickened continental plates settled slowly to their equilibrium depth, just as a person's body sinks into a waterbed. Sinking mountains increase the pressure under the crust of both sides of mountain ranges. Consequently, weaker portions of the overlying crust fractured and uplifted, forming plateaus, even on the ocean floor. In other words, as continents and mountains sank, plateaus rose. This explains why plateaus are adjacent to major mountain ranges. For example, the Tibetan Plateau, the largest in the world, is next to the most massive mountain range in the world, the Himalayas. The Tibetan Plateau covers 750,000 square miles and rose 3 miles relative to the continent. The Colorado Plateau, next to the Rocky Mountains, and the Columbia Plateau, next to the Cascade Mountains, are other dramatic examples.